Okay, so I'm going to kick off by trying to dispel the supposed tension between common cause and the values modes approach. So I'm going to launch us off on a notion of furious agreement. It's a bit like saying, do you like chocolate or cheese? And then Philadelphia produces chocolate cream cheese. And we all go, actually, I like both. I like that combined into one. So I think there's a false polarity here. There's a great kind of classic thing about activism and campaigners coming together and saying, when we're asked to form a firing squad, we all stand in a circle and shoot each other. In actual fact, there's a really great alignment. There's a reason why common cause in particular resonates with us, is because we tend to be pioneers. We tend to be slightly more intrinsically motivated and intrinsically value-focused. That's why we love it. Unfortunately, the rest of the world is not always like that. I personally have an issue as well in terms of my personal engagement with common cause. I think I align with it as an individual, but I have some struggles with it in terms of practical and professional application as a communicator. And there was an issue which was raised last year when we had someone from the RSPB talking about, how do you get people to come to nature reserves, and should it always be about an intrinsic connection with the wonderful value of nature? And he said, well, that's half our audience gone because they only come for the tea shop. So you've got to kind of work with where people are at, and that's very much the work that Futerra has focused on the last couple of years through our sort of love not loss work for the IUCN, the International Conservation Union. And it's about touching people in different ways. There are people who are intrinsically motivated up front. There are people who have a more utilitarian approach to ecosystem value and services, and people who actually just love nature because of the way it makes them feel as individuals. Now, none of those are problematic, and this is where I do agree with a lot of the work that Tom and Rich have done at Common Cause, is about using both. I do think it's about using extrinsic values to get people in the door, and then trying to get them into a kind of deeper engagement. And the example I always use on this is the transformation of London cycling in the last 10 years, where the number of cyclists, and I'm a London cyclist, has doubled in the last decade. And that's largely despite government rather than because of. And that's happened for a whole host of different reasons. Lots of people have got onto bikes because it saves them money, because it saves them time, because it gets them to work quicker, because it makes them look cool, because they get nice tight buttocks so they don't have to go to the gym. There's a whole kind of multiple kind of suite of reasons why people have started cycling. Once they have started cycling, I think they then inevitably get engaged in issues around environment, air quality, road space, congestion, all of those factors. So it's using the extrinsic connection with why they would want to cycle in the first place, and then trying to engage them in the deeper debates about why cycling might be a good thing. So my premise is there isn't a polarisation here. We're all trying to work together in the same direction, and people will ultimately change because they want to, not because they have to.
Thank you very much. And Richard, we're going to go straight on to you.
Cool, thanks. So for the past 5 years, I've sort of been on a journey searching for some sustainable elixir or some magic bullet. And I'm sorry to say I haven't found it, bar maybe shooting everyone into space while watching David Attenborough documentaries, listening to Brian Eno, which I was going to talk with you afterwards about maybe a business plan on that, which has lots of other problems. But I was sort of reflecting on that journey, and it seems to me that I've been on one. I've started at facts and moved to values, basically, through a lot of different things. So I started out helping climate scientists to communicate more effectively and sustainable technologists and other things. And jazzing up making their facts sexy, that's probably what you'd say. Making it more accessible and more appealing to different audiences. And it just felt dissatisfying. It wasn't quite working. There was something else going on. And so via loads of other things, whether it's metaphors, infographics, stories, narratives and images, sort of ended up at values, which is where I'm at now. And I think there's probably 3 things that I thought I'd share with you that I've learned on that journey, I suppose. The first one is that piecemeal behaviour change is not going to work. It's not sufficient. The scale of the challenge that we face is enormous. It's a systemic issue, which means it's system level. It's everywhere. I thought I'd pull out a quote from Bob Watson in February, just before the Rio summit. He said, "Essentially nothing has changed in 20 years. We are not remotely on course to be sustainable. The current political system is broken." It seems to me that in that respect, slicing off behaviours is not going to get you there. We need something more. The second, I suppose, thing I've learned is that values matter. There's an enormous amount of empirical evidence that shows that there's a certain set of values which, if people hold strongly and prioritise, values that we call intrinsic values, things like equality, broad-mindedness, creativity, connection to nature, affiliation with friends and family and things, that if they value those things strongly, then they're much more likely to be great, pursue pro-social and pro-environmental behaviour and attitudes and various things. And then the third thing, I suppose, that I've learned is that we need to address the cultural factors that shape our values if we really want to work that. We can't just make individual interventions because we need broad and durable behaviour change. And you can't do that without values, but you can't actually influence values without picking off bigger things, bigger factors. And starting to look at society and what shapes values in society, I think, is the most important thing that we need to be doing. And we've all got our own constraints on the extent to which we can do that. But the amount of commercial advertising and marketing, the time poverty that people face, working long hours on multiple jobs, or on the flip side, mass unemployment is much larger than it is now. It's been hidden since the 90s by sort of disability living allowance and similar things. Or Victorian levels of inequality, our obsession with GDP, the housing crisis, various things. They're all things that are pinning people away from actually being concerned and acting on what they already care about. It's not a very convenient answer for all of you, but I think it's the truth, that we can't address the destruction of the natural world unless we start addressing those things as well.
Thank you very much. John?
Thank you. Well, I want to start with saying I've been really impressed with what I've experienced these couple of days and like the diversity of communication efforts that's going in here. Very much of this, some of this, of course, has to do with trying to influence specific behavior change. And I agree with Rick that obviously when we look at the big problems that we're facing, just focusing at one specific behavior at a time will not get us there before it's too late. On the other hand, when asking the question, like the headline of this debate is like changing behavior or influence and core values, I would say like definitely behavior still. Because why do we want to change core values? Like why do you want to change core values? In order to change behavior in a more fundamental way, obviously. And I think that's right. I mean, we do know that if we do want to have bigger changes in behavior, we need to prepare the grounds. Educating people, informing people, using campaigning is indispensable. We also know, however, that campaigns that target these broader issues, like especially value campaign changes, in and of themselves have a very bad record. Not much has happened, like in the short run, in the run that we can, measure. So what do we want to do? I mean, we want to use communication to prepare the ground for the bigger changes. Yesterday, there was one of the tables mentioning we need to target people in power, and I think we do. We need to use much more of our effort to what social marketeers now call upstream social marketing, meaning that thinking about campaigning and value change campaigning as a means to influence those in power, to make them do the things that really matters, and that is making real changes in everyday life. And these real changes will be what changes behavior. That is, we need expanding alternative renewable energy, and the Danish government has decided 2020, 50% of our electricity consumption will be from renewable energy. That's a bold thing to do. The British government should do the same thing. How will we make them do that? Campaigning will help prepare the grounds for that, but that's not enough. I mean, so we need directly also convincing these people in power what they're going to do. We need to focus on the most important things. I hadn't heard you say so much about that. Any of the two first speakers, I'm sure they agree about that. Like, there's a whole range of different things we can do. We need to focus much more of our efforts on the really important thing. The most important thing is the stock of housing. Britain has a lot of really old houses that are so energy inefficient. They ought to be much more energy efficient. How do they get there? By, laws and regulations. How do we get these laws and regulations in place? By getting people on board accepting these. And then, of course, comes the question of how do we get people to accept these laws and regulations. I think I've used my 2 minutes, but then perhaps in the next part of the debate I'll say something about that.
We'll definitely hear more from all of our panelists. Theresa.
Thanks very much. At the risk of being a bull in a china shop, this is not my broad field in terms of content, but my interest is in behaviour change. And my thesis is, if you're interested in changing behaviour, forget about values and change environments. And by environments, I mean physical environments, social environments, economic environments, and commercial environments. I want to make 3 points about that. The first, why shouldn't we target values? Well, the values in this country and elsewhere are pretty much good enough for legitimizing changing environments to change behaviour. Secondly, it's ineffective. The most effective way of changing values is for people to change their behaviour. So to give you a couple of examples of what I'm talking about, I'll talk about 2 behaviours that have what are called health co-benefits. So they benefit both the environment and health. So one is active transport and the other is sustainable diet. So active transport, one of the main factors that influence whether or not people don't get in their cars is the walkability of towns. So that's very technical, not enough time to go into that, but the design of and layout of towns. We can think about walkability inside buildings. So we know that if the stairs are more visible, if there are fewer escalators, and if the lift doors close very slowly, people use the stairs. If we think about sustainable diets, we know that the production and consumption of red and processed meat is really bad for the environment, really bad for our health. Many, many meals are provided out of the public purse in schools and hospitals. So we know that making the healthier and the more sustainable choice easier increases the likelihood that people go for it. We're just like rats in a maze. We find the easiest way through it. So there is no objective reason why schools and hospitals shouldn't offer sustainable diets and no longer offer red and processed meat. Except, of course, there is agricultural policies, and we can maybe come on to that. So how do we achieve these kinds of changes? It's bottom-up and top-down. So bottom-up, I think that's partly what this conference is about. There are incredible innovations in community-led projects. I just picked one out that I like. The sound of Rubies in the Rubble. There are many others. We've got innovation in terms of models for new businesses. So we've got peer-to-peer investment, say, in sustainable energy. And we've also got innovation in the design of economic systems. So Tim Jackson's book, Prosperity Without Growth. We've got the Skidelskis writing about how much is enough. We've got Andrew Sims and others at the Economics Foundation, the New Economics Foundation, writing about the New Green Deal. So much, very exciting what's happening bottom-up. Top-down, that is the big challenge. So I've only 2 things to say about that. The first is we could reveal to those in power public positive attitudes, broadly positive, towards doing things to improve environments. We could teach them about behavioural and brain sciences that tell us that much of our behaviour is automatic and not influenced by appeal to reason. The only other suggestion I would have is to support the repeal of the funding of political parties. My pitch.
Thank you to all of our speakers for throwing some ideas out. I want to go straight out to the audience and gather maybe 4 or 5 either reactions or comments or observations from your own work.
I think yesterday the Society of the Environment, there's somebody talking about wanting to unify a message for people communicating about this kind of change. And I would argue that happiness is a unifying message that brings people together because it encourages people to talk about what their values are, those values which, as you've just pointed out, drive behaviour. And it's also a conversation which you can have from the bottom up and the top down, which is what the Happy City Initiative is doing in Bristol, aiming to engage people with things that they already know. I think we all have an intuitive understanding about what is good and bad, if you like, about would make us happier. And that involves absolutely the environment in which we live, because after all, we're a part of nature, as you've already pointed out in the conference. So helping people to find the things which increase happiness around them, to highlight what works and build on that, because there's so much already in existence, is a very powerful powerful way of motivating people to begin measuring themselves what the prosperity might mean. And that, of course, feeds a top-down process. It connects the top-down finally with the bottom-up. So that's just an illustration of the power of happiness. And I'd be interested to know what the panel has to say about happiness in relation to their own points of view.
We talked yesterday about, a lot of people expressed, in the room, expressed support for perhaps, I don't know if manipulation is the word, but that was the word that was used yesterday, perhaps when we know that we have the good of the planet, that's our aim, that perhaps some manipulation is okay. I think a lot of us would agree that one of the major threats or the major drivers of environmental problems is the other side of that, the advertising that is kind of present in everybody's lives and is manipulating people to buy more and more, to consume more and more things that we don't need, that ultimately probably make us unhappy and are destroying the planet. And I wondered if there is scope for coming together on that, maybe exposing the lies, the manipulation of advertising industry. And I think, obviously we don't have the budget collectively to compare, but I think there is something there in that, and kind of telling the other side of the story as well, and how people's values are manipulated for very, wrong reasons as well.
We all know that we need to consume less in society as a whole. But at the same time, when you talk about the very disadvantaged and so on, in that adjustment, some of them need to consume more to come up to a standard of living that's acceptable. They need to be kept warm, they need to eat proper food, they need better surroundings and so on. So it is not a single message, but a message in society as to what our vision is.
Lots of nodding. Is there one more? Yeah.
Hi, Paul from Countryscape. I think there's a role for systems thinking in all of this. I think there's a lot of pressure placed on us as consumers to deal with the problems that we're talking about. I think if we look earlier on in the system, in the way we extract resources, the way we manufacture products, I think there's a great opportunity to limit the number of bad choices we can make as consumers by addressing these problems earlier on in the system. And the elephant in the room, or perhaps the elephant not in this room, are those large manufacturing companies, supermarkets, the people who produce the products that are causing the problems we're talking about. And I think we need to address that as much as putting pressure on consumers to make those choices.
Should we get maybe a couple of comments from the panel? Is anyone ready to Ed?
Just very quickly. I can take them. I'll do them in literally about 1 minute. Mike, totally agree with happiness. All of our positioning at Futerra has been about making sustainability so desirable it becomes normal. And if you want to subvert the dominant paradigm, you have to have more fun than they are and let them know while you're doing it. And so it has to be about that positive energy. And that taps in to this notion of a vision, which I think is my response to when Rich says, we need something more than behaviour change. I said, well, yes, we do. We need behaviour change in the context of a bigger vision about what this sizzling, sustainable future looks like, what people get out of it, what it feels like, what it tastes like, what it smells like, the fact that it is fun. I live a pretty sustainable life and I have a bloody great time. And I spend my whole time trying to tell everyone about it by, trying to embody that positivity. I also agree that we would like some respite from advertising. I think it's pernicious in its all-pervasiveness, but it's not evil per se. It's just communication. And I've made this argument many times because, we're all advertising all the time when we just communicate to each other. But we're having zones in cities which has been trialled around the world, which are free of advertising, I think would be perfect. And advertising to kids is just evil. And finally, systems thinking. Yes, I totally agree. I think the big corporates that are really getting progressive now, we've just done some work with Kingfisher. You might have seen the holding company behind B&Q. They've launched a net positive initiative. They are adopting a systems thinking approach to their sustainability. They want to be a net positive contributor to global ecology by 2050. That's a hugely ambitious plan, and I think it's game-changing, and I think it's really exciting.
Okay, I think both of our panel want to come in. I'm going to keep an eye out for hands at any point. Theresa?
Yes, I'd like to endorse, I think, all the comments. I think it is about systems. It is about our environments. Our environments are cueing and shaping our behaviour in ways that we are not aware. And I think actually if we look at one of the most successful areas in certainly high-income countries for changing behaviour, it's been with reducing the amount of tobacco consumption. And one of the ways in which that has been achieved was not by telling people this is bad for you, you should be choosing differently. It was about changing our environments through cracking down on an industry that had a vested interest in selling a product that in this case was killing people. So I think it's very important that we focus on changing environments, not trying to change people's values so they make better decisions in an environment that's trying to push them in a completely different way. And I think WWF have produced a very interesting report on marketing, and I think one of the key variables one needs to be able to document, we need more evidence about how our behaviour is cued without awareness. So people watching advertisements who actually don't want to eat more cream cakes, they don't want to be drinking more alcohol, and yet, as a result of watching these ads, they find themselves doing this. So we need to collect more evidence to be able to show when our behaviour is being manipulated beyond what actually we want. And I think then it's another question for governments or others in control to regulate environments so people can live lives, behave in ways that fit with dominant values.
I'd like to respond. Should we come back to Richard, and then I know you want to join in?
In terms of advertising, yeah, so we co-wrote the report with WWF on advertising role in shaping culture and values. I'd love your help, Nicola, in terms of making that happen, because we tried and they all bailed. Like, we got lots of interested NGOs together and said, this is a really big thing. You could come together in a very strange coalition that wouldn't actually be easily pigeonholed, and you could make some really profound statements and do some really creative stuff. And they're too risk-averse, too conservative, which is crazy, really, but that's where they're at the moment. Yeah, so, I mean, and so we'll try with other things like that, but it's really hard, it's really surprising. I think... I think there are two more elephants in the room. There are three elephants in the room. That's good because it's sort of, wildlife. The first is in relation to the consumers and how you change those upstream systems, or in relation to political leadership. How do you make that happen? Because it's not like no one's been trying. And the thing for me is when I think about tobacco, if we'd stand back and be objective about how long it took us to reduce the amount of smoking in society, we have to be honest that the industry massively delayed how quickly we would have naturally done that without an industry being there. We have a real problem with that. And if you think about sustainability, we're taking on the industry that powers the world, literally. And it's not even just that industry. It's not even just fossil fuel companies. It's also, loads of agricultural companies, loads of property developers. It's loads of stuff that needs change. So the political inertia that comes about from those vested interests is enormous. And I think the point we're trying to make is that I don't see the change coming about. There will be changes in those places, but the actual proportionate change to the scale of the challenge will have to be through some sort of popular pressure. And the question is, how does that popular pressure come about? And I think that is importantly about values. And I agree with Theresa completely about changing environments, because I think changing those environments changes values. But how do you change the environments with a very reluctant political system? And and I'd endorse her thing about party political stuff as well.
Great, I'm going to bring John in and then go back to the audience.
Yeah, I want to emphasize again, just evidence that we shouldn't focus too much on the individual changes. As you said, actually, some need to consume more, others need to consume less. We all need to consume less, so that's a collective thing. It's not a message to the individual consumer. It's not a message to even the millionaire. It's a message to all of us. So we need measures that make us, in total, consume less, while those that need it consume more. There's a study published in the Journal of Consumer Policy earlier this year, a Hungarian study that analyzed the footprint of green and grey consumers in Hungary, and it found that there was no difference. Ecological footprint was not related at all to political values or to green values. Simply no difference. And that's a very thorough study, which means, of course, again, we need to do things at the system level, as somebody said. I could be a little bit worried with, I agree with I went to the common cause session before, and I agreed actually with practically everything that was said there. It's really important. But I could be a little bit worried if the message becomes that we cannot engage, for instance, with economics and economics arguments. One of the big problems right now is that in terms of crisis, economics takes all the attention. We can see that in all kinds of public polls, that what people are concerned about now is whether they will keep their jobs tomorrow, the economics of things. What politicians are concerned about now is the economics of things. So there's a, and of course all of us think that's also important. Of course it is. We just happen to think that the environment is even more important. So one solution to that, which is actually like a marketing solution, would be try and link the environmental issue to what's concerning people now, that is the economics. And now, actually, I think, like there's right now a discourse talking about green growth. And I think many of us feel very strong reservations about that. And me too, actually. But I think that's actually the discourse that has the potential of doing something in the short run. I mean, if politicians are getting to dare do something effectively with the environment, you have to link it to employment and economics. And there's obvious issues here, like renewing housing, investing in infrastructure gives local jobs and can improve strongly, can have a great impact on shaping the environment so that they become more sustainable in the longer run. I think actually we should take that on and say, right now, it's green employment we want.
Isn't that Tim Jackson's thesis in Prosperity
without
growth? And Andrew Sims wrote very eloquently about this in Sunday's Observer. So I think you're absolutely right.
It's Tim and I.
I'm going to go back to the group. I'm going to just try to get 3 or 4 hands. Darren?
Darren Hall, manager of the Bristol Green Capital Partnership. We've spent last year talking about Big Green Week, about making all this stuff really uplifting and happy and bring people with us and all that kind of stuff. But we're facing a crisis that will make the banking thing look like a picnic. Might it not be time that we all just get together and say, this is it. This is the most horrendous thing we're facing, because the Dunkirk spirit, it allegedly is the thing that brings people together to get something done.
I'm Jenny, I'm representing Economic and Social Research Council. Basically, I was just thinking about the sort of 2 lines of thought that's been going on in the whole conference. There's engaging the public in scientific research and 2-way public engagement. And then there's evidence and research and engaging policymakers and policy influencers, which is what Theresa's just touched on. I just wondered about the 3-way engagement and all your 4 of you thoughts on how the 3 link up. That's the research, the evidence, the public and the policy influencers.
Just about. Mark, over to you.
Hello, Mark Leach from Council. So Theresa, you said forget values at one point. And I liked it when Ed started off and he said, it's not polarised. We can do several different approaches. And I think changing the environment is really, really important, and I'm involved in that a little bit. But I think sometimes that makes the assumption that we're all rational beings, and all the decisions about where we shop and what mode of transport we use around the city are based on rational. We've weighed up the pros and cons, and they're not, clearly. We wouldn't be driving BMW X5s around Bristol. They're status-driven, and there are other reasons for those decisions. So clearly, as we're not going fast enough with some of the elements of behaviour change, is it not worth carrying on the amazing work about changing the environment and affecting behaviour change through little changes that David Slowly was talking about yesterday, for example, but also having a really good look at core values, because ultimately the evidence is that core values drive behaviour, not the other way around.
I'll come back on the military one, just because I think that's always a temptation. Everyone always wants to go back to the Blitz spirit or the Dunkirk spirit or, that great motivation of people that occurred during the Second World War. The reason that happened is because families were dying on the battlefield. Tens of thousands of countrymen from this country were being killed. And that's what galvanised people. Unfortunately, we don't have that. We might think this is just as horrific, and it may well be in a different way and in a longer way. But the reason we don't get the Dunkirk spirit is because people's families aren't being killed. And for better or for worse, we need to drop the kind of fearful war metaphor, because I fear that will just take us backwards, because it goes back to the kind of 1970s kind of disaster-mongering environmentalists.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Ed on that in terms of the war stuff, because I think we just live in a different society now. We're so much more individualised, and we're going to have to unpick a lot of that before we can get to anywhere near that. And having things that do that sort of thing are great, but I'm just not sure, and the values research speaks to the fear and threats thing, and I'm not sure war is the right thing that does it. And I know Caroline Lucas has got stuff going on, and I'm not that keen on that. I think in terms of the we're not rational stuff, I mean, that's what Common Cause came out of. It was a sort of an exploration of why it is that people do what they do and think what they think. A question that Tom Crompton asked, having worked for 5 years at World Trade Organization level on international trade and development policy, constantly frustrated with the lack of progress there, meeting individual negotiators who were saying, I'm personally committed to exactly what you're saying, like a German Green who was saying, I think this is completely right, but I simply don't feel the public pressure from the capital, from the country on our politicians to be able to pushing this forward. So he stepped back and said, so what creates that political pressure? And came to, ask a lot of different academic disciplines this, and values seem to be one of the things that came out. And I think in terms of Theresa saying that sort of values don't matter, there is a lot of evidence that values do matter. There's a lot of evidence in certain situations that values matter less. But I think it also tends to be that looking at the most significant environmental behaviours, things with the highest social cost, that's where actually there's a larger value action gap, but at the same time values matter, because if you hold them very strongly, you're much more likely to be not doing those things. And I think the problem is with people talking about values that matter is that they take the things with the highest social cost, like flying and driving, and they extrapolate them to everything else. And they also often only look at individual behaviours. And there's lots of studies that show when you aggregate across behaviours and you iron out all the other things that get in the way, you find that values are a really big driver. And it matters a lot about how you measure those values and whether you're just asking and what model you use for them. But it does seem that they do matter. They're not the only thing, and that's where I agree in terms of environments, because that really matters too.
I think we should hand over to Theresa. We keep quoting her.
Oh, sorry, yes. So values don't matter for changing behaviour. So I'm being slightly extreme. I'm pushing the argument. But I'd be very keen to see where the evidence is for values not just predicting behaviour. They're weakly associated. And I'm just familiar with the evidence base, particularly in the context of changing behaviour for health-related behaviours. But when people have pulled the literature in a systematic way, intentions, which are a reflection of values, so this is about people's reflective system, are very, very weak predictors of people's behaviour and behaviour change. And so that's why in behaviour and brain sciences, people are now much more interested in automatic processes, the automaticity of everyday behaviour, which is why it's so important that, given how important this issue is, we shift the ground and stop talking about values, because you're not going to shift behaviour if you're still talking about values. Values of politicians, I think that does become pretty important, although if I knew how to shift their values, I wouldn't be sitting here. The other question from the back about, this is it, and I completely understand that sort of deep, deep frustration. And isn't this where part of the environment field started? Sort of shouting about we're all going to hell in a handcart very, very quickly. We know psychologically from terror management theory, and if you don't know about that, look it up. It's absolutely fascinating. It's about psychoanalysis meets social psychology. So we're all heavily defended against annihilation. And so as soon as people start talking about that, that's when defences come up. So I don't think that is a strategy, but you're absolutely right. This is pretty much it. So that's why I think we should be looking at funding of political parties, because if one starts to look at what's getting at those people in charge, actually it's short-term interest from these companies who stand to gain from no behaviour change.
Very quickly.
So I just think in terms of the values and behaviour, I think that's where it might be interesting to compare the differences between health and the environment and whether there are those differences in terms of it being in different environments and having to choose to do some environmental things.
Well, I'm thinking about some of the behaviours which have co-benefits. So, for example, active travel. Actually, values don't influence how people get around the place. It's about the environment. And you were just talking about these data. If you look at people's values, green, grey values, actually, people's behaviour is not shaped by that.
So I think, the other thing to say is I think the other reason that, so the correlations are never high for individual behaviours, but when you aggregate across them, they seem to become higher.
No,
and then
not in the reviews.
we can share the studies after.
Yeah, okay.
I think the other reason that the values are important is because we get obsessed with behaviours, and actually attitudes matter a lot. Attitudes matter in terms of what people are willing to do and how they share that and how they actually go about changing things. Because we get obsessed with behaviour, but actually who people vote for, whether they're willing to go and join something and do something more than what they're thinking about, does actually have quite a significant impact, particularly when I think we need to change those environments and we're currently lacking the political will to change those environments. So the extent to which... So I think the third elephant in the room is that you can predict ecological footprint, about 80% of it based on income. And so we need to reducing our income in the UK. Who's going to be willing to start to talk about that? It's going to be people, I think, who value that thing really strongly.
I'm really keen to bring in, I've had 3 or 4 hands, and for everyone else, I can see you all nodding or shaking your head. Please join in the debate and tell us what you're thinking.
It would be interesting to do a sort of real-time test of, with people in the room, who I'm making a big assumption have sort of attitudes and values which are pro-environmental. I'd like to know how many people in this room actually belong to a political party and are active within it.
Should we pose that question to the audience, if you feel happy to answer? Involved and active within a political party?
Only a couple.
But that's not the only way that you can engage with that thing. That's only narrow.
Any sustainable or voluntary green organisations, maybe, like active members, rather than just...
Yeah.
If you raise your hands, if you are one of those...
Should put that question to the audience. The question was, if you're happy to participate, active and involved within a green or sustainability organisation? Excellent.
What you would expect.
I still need to come back and let John participate, but I'm keen to get those who haven't yet. Simon?
Simon Garrett, Head of Learning, Bristol Zoo. Apologies for anyone who came to my workshop last year, but I have an interest in this link between values and behaviour, and there seems to be almost a loop going on here. I've heard people say that actually values affect behaviour and vice versa. Perhaps the way into that loop, though, for people who aren't like us, because remember, we're not normal, and the rest of the world are. I mean, seriously, remember that the whole time. We are a group of utterly abnormal people by the simple fact that we're here. And that show of hands a moment ago is because we all work for conservation organisations. That's why we're active within them. We're not normal. To get normal people involved, I think the way in is through actions. And very briefly, I can tell you more about this some other time, or column me at coffee, but some zoos in Australia are doing some really interesting things, and one example is with recycled toilet paper. If you get the people who use recycled toilet paper and buy it and those who don't, they both believe that using recycled toilet paper is good for wildlife. There is no difference in their belief. The reason that people who don't buy recycled toilet paper don't buy it is for 3 things. 1, they think it's more expensive, even if it isn't. 2, they think it's actually too thin and their fingers will go through when they're using it. And 3, that it's going to be uncomfortable on their bums when they're wiping it. You know, all eco things are scratchy, aren't they? So actually what these zoos have been doing is addressing those 3 issues, and they have proved that they have turned people who previously didn't buy recycled toilet paper into users. And once they are then doing that, and the way they do it, they start congratulating them for using it. It says something about them. It actually begins to change their core values, and then they're more predisposed to going and do other pro-environmental behaviours. So find out why people aren't doing what you want them to do, address those issues, get them to do it, and that will begin to actually influence their underlying values as well. If you want to know more about crap man and recycled toilet paper, see me later.
Okay, see Simon about crap man. Quickly at the back. I think we've got two at the back for take.
Hi, I'm sorry to come back again because there's a bit of me that would love to be up there on the panel, so forgive me for sort of speaking twice. But what Susan and Simon have both just mentioned is assumptions, which is the piece between your values and your behaviours, if you like, and it's a critical piece. People have been talking about systems thinking. You're absolutely right. We're all interdependent. We all understand that in our various different ways. So when we talk about advertising or big corporations, they're not actually root causes in the system. If you stand back and look at the system, the assumption driving everything is that finance and GDP growth in particular is the most important thing. The reason the Treasury kicks everybody else wherever it likes is because finance, money, is the only piece that's truly measured in a way that people consider empirical and scientific and valid, if you like. So when we have discussions about what really matters, we're getting into the value side of things, and we're testing and pushing at those assumptions which drive all of the challenges that we all face, I would argue. And I'm very happy to talk to anybody at considerable length about happiness and the value of a systems-based approach at a city scale, because people understand the difference they can make individually for themselves. Yes, I get that. They understand the difference they can make in a group. I get that. They understand their city. If they know that communities across their city are also making similar scale changes, they get that and they think, oh, that's quite big, actually. I'm starting to make a connection between little old me and these bloody great big problems. If you know that cities across the country are also engaged in the same style of engagement and questioning and testing of assumptions and pushing at what should be different, then you've got the change you want.
Thank you. Was there a comment next to you?
Sorry.
I can tell my panel are about to jump off with comments.
Sorry, it was just I promised myself I would do this. The next time someone said we're not normal is to correct them. Everybody wants clean air. Everybody likes trees, for example. This is universal.
Yeah.
And to think otherwise is absurd.
Yeah.
What we have is challenges and barriers to opportunity to shape it or to be part of a movement for change in it. So, yeah, okay, we're doing slightly different things, but even the doing seems, lots of people in this room have a car. And they're doing a lot more damage than people that don't have a car. So we are normal, and everyone else around us is also normal too. That's all.
Thank you.
Yeah.
It feels like we're just getting into things, and we're kind of coming to the end of our time. So what I'm going to do is ask each of our panellists to sum up this incredible debate in a couple of minutes. And if I can ask them, assuming you're all staying for lunch, one thing people in the audience should come and ask you about over lunch. Who'd like to go first? Sum up and a lunchtime question.
I'll go first.
Okay.
I can't help but think there's about, if it's toilet paper, how many behaviours are there we need to get in order to get to sustainability? Is it like 500, 700? It just seems like that. It's madness. And in terms of the meeting people where they are, I hear this so much, particularly in our work recently going into conservation groups. And my interpretation of it, as a working class kid from Bristol, is it's code for we need to watch X Factor, The Apprentice and The Great British Bake Off and make assumptions about who people are, what they value and what they're like. And I just think it's a bit offensive. Like, the best way, it's a self-fulfilling prophecy if you keep saying we're abnormal, we're not like that. Just go and talk to loads of people, see what they like, see what they're interested in, and talk to them about it, and design projects that actually meet people where they are. I'm sort of suspicious of it as a phrase anyway, because there's no opposite of it, is there? If they're not there, it's not a meeting. So you're not... I don't know. I completely agree with Theresa on the changing environments. We disagree on the values point, but I think environments shape values, and that's really, really important. And all of the political finance stuff and other things is really, really true. I completely agree with Ed in terms of the disagreement being exaggerated at times. There's actually a lot that he agrees on, but I think that disagreement at the end is fundamental. But I think it is interesting to start trying hybrid approaches and testing those, but I think you have to test them in a real way. So if you're appealing to extrinsic stuff first and you want to engage them with something more intrinsic in the long term, then you need to test to see what actually happens afterwards and whether it works, because it doesn't necessarily. And there are studies that show that that initial framing matters. But that, I think, is a really interesting bit to explore. And then I think finally coming back to Ed's point about we need a sizzling vision. I feel like if I have to be in another meeting where someone says we need an exciting vision, I'm going to shoot myself. Like, we've got lots of exciting visions. We've got lots of exciting stories and stuff. The thing that we're not willing to look at is that for every one story and vision that we have, the advertising and marketing industry is hitting people with 100 or 500,000 every day. They're the storytellers in our society at the moment, and they're saturating our ability to actually talk about a sustainable future, because everything, a large proportion of what they're doing is not that. And there's little bits and pieces where they're changing, definitely, but unless we change those bigger drivers, we're not going to win. And one thing to talk to me about afterwards.
What should people come and ask you about over lunch?
I have no idea.
I'll come back to you.
Okay.
They want a reason to come and chat with you, Richard. I'll come back to you. Anyone like to go next?
I can sort of try to wrap up. I think the extension of my sort of cycling example of earlier, I do think there is something very interesting in terms of this dynamic of whether values lead behaviour change or behaviour change leads values. The argument I was making was when you stitch together the multiple motivations, you get people connected to a bigger issue. And I would say in that sense, a behaviour can connect issues. A behaviour change can connect issues. So it starts to join up money, personal fitness, health, air quality and environmental stuff just by getting people engaged in that. And that's where I agree with Theresa as well. The shift in London cycling has been because of the three factors: the personal motivations that I already outlined, the sort of social proof, the visibility and the salience of that of other people cycling. I started cycling in London 15 years ago and it was pretty lonely. Now I'm part of a sort of Tour de France peloton as I go in the mornings. No Lance Armstrong, but we're there. And then the infrastructure, with the kind of the crap blue lanes and the dodgy Barclays bikes and all of these types of things going in. And if you speak to people at Transport for London, they are not about transport. Those Boris bikes are about a culture shift. Because there was only a few thousand of them in town. There was 9 million journeys made by public transport every day in London. The bikes contribute a few tens of thousands at absolute max. What they are is about a cultural perception shift about cycling in the city. And they are about the visibility, they're about the chance to experiment, they're about the chance to try and get on a bike and see what it's like. And I think that is the clever stuff. And so I think when you start to align those things, the personal, social, and infrastructural, that's when you start to get transformative change. And I fundamentally disagree with Rich on visions being boring. I do agree that we talk about it too much. But I believe our stories are powerful. We are normal. We are connected in. And it's a failure of the sales job and our communication skills to ignite and excite and inspire people to get involved, because everyone does care.
What should people come and ask you about over lunch?
What I had for dinner last night.
Low carbon travel.
Low carbon travel, yeah.
Low carbon travel. Theresa, John?
Well, I think what I want to emphasize that I'm not against working with values. I think there's one perspective we haven't really talked about.
So you're against working with?
I'm not against working on values,
okay.
Just to make that clear. I think that one of the representatives for environmental NGOs is actually working with values. So it depends also on who you are. In this room, there's lots of people from NGOs. There's also people from government organizations. Perhaps for government organizations, it's less an issue of working with values. But when that's said, I agree with Therese that values isn't our biggest problem right now. I think the normal values are actually there, but we communicators need also to speak to them. So this is partly about having people act for the right reasons. And the right reasons depends on what you want them to do. So coming back to what I said before about what's the most important thing, if you want people to retrofit their houses, don't speak so much about values. You have to speak about what's the payback time for this investment. If you ignore that, you don't get people. You are not taken seriously. If you want people to change the type of toilet paper that they use, it's a very good idea to speak about the bigger pictures of the small steps. And that way, there's actually pretty much research that shows that people's values get reinforced if you praise them. I like that example a lot. if you congratulate them for these small things that they do, and they become more aware about their values. I think they have the values, but they can become more aware about the values, and therefore also perhaps as voters and so on become more aware about what they're going to do. And not only the toilet paper thing, but actually also as bicyclists. When you do ambitious things for the environment, I mean, you might bicycle because of your health and because it's quicker, cheaper, and so on in London. But if people congratulate you and praise you for being an environmentalist, that may actually make these values more salient to you, which may have implications for how you would respond if a survey asks you, would you be for having a congestion charge in Bristol, for instance, or in Copenhagen, where we just dropped that one on the floor but recently. I mean, these kind of issues. So I'm in the longer run, but it's a long-term strategy. It's not a short-term strategy. It's a long-term strategy. And I would like people to speak to me about how I found that getting people active in their everyday life actually made them more accepting of wind power.
About wind power. Excellent. Lunchtime conversation.
Yeah.
Theresa.
Well, first I'd like to thank the organisers for inviting me, because it has been great for me to engage with a group of people who are interested in changing behaviour in populations, but we're different tribes. And that suggests to me there is real benefit in those interested in behaviour change, whether it's for health or environment, and very often it's for both, coming together. I've heard, and maybe this is because it's my bias, that there's been quite a bit of rehearsal, particularly the last comment at the back, that actually we do share the same values. This is not an issue of changing values, and it is important that we focus much more on systems for changing behaviour. I'll just give one example of a topic in my own research group that we're looking at. We're interested in placement of products in supermarkets and how that influences the likelihood that it ends up in your basket, and trying to tease apart price promotion, the nature of the product, and its placement. And what I can tell you is the placement is playing a very large part, often larger than price. So this is just an example of the automaticity of everyday behaviour. I think, I'm not an economist, but I think, again, one of the penultimate point about happiness, I think it is about looking at alternative models. It is about looking at how can societies thrive without being hell-bent on growth. We've tried that. It doesn't work. Now it's a great opportunity for economists who can think outside of the box together with others to come together and rehearse what kind of models we could have. I'm not staying for lunch because I have to get back to Cambridge because I'm part of a group hosting Ian Duncan Smith coming to talk to us this evening. So I will be engaging in the third part of the agenda that I have, which I've done many times before, and we can see imperceptible shift of trying to talk to those in power about how we understand the nature of human behaviour.
Thank you very much. And just handing back to Richard quickly, anything?
I thought of it. Over lunch, you can talk to me about the study that found that they surveyed all the astronauts that had been into space, and they found that afterwards their values shifted to become more self-transcendent and intrinsic.
Excellent. Hopefully a little bit of food for thought over food. I'm about to invite you for lunch, but can we just finish with a huge thanks again to Carnegie UK Trust and to all of our speakers and yourselves.
Actually,